All right, welcome back to your next episode of .LA Dives In. I'm Kelly O'Grady, .LA's chief host and correspondent, and today I'm joined by Dr. Cheryl Ingram, CEO and founder of Diverse City, as well as the CEO and founder of Inclusology. So Cheryl, welcome, and thank you so much for giving your time today.
Sure. Thank you for having me, Kelly. I'm excited to get this conversation going.
Yeah, we are going to dive in. So in the wake of George Floyd's death at the hands of the 4 police officers in Minneapolis, we're seeing an outcry across the country and actually even the world in many forms. Protests on social media, individuals and companies turning inward and reflecting on how to better foster diversity, equity, inclusion, to name a few. But this isn't just all about George Floyd. This is about the larger picture, the systems and culture in place that allow these things to happen. And your work at Diverse City and Inclusology really tackles exactly this. So I'm grateful for you joining me today for a discussion about actionable steps to fight racism and how startups and tech companies can create more inclusive workspaces. I just want to start off with the question of how are you experiencing right now everything that's going on?
Yeah, definitely in our business, like you said, we deal a lot with different kinds of isms, especially racism within within companies, and even within this country. And so right now there seems to be this heightened urgency around people wanting to do something, right? Because every so often, monthly we'll get calls from 10 to 15 companies that say, we want to do something in this space that has to do with gender equality, race. We know that we have an issue. We can see it, right? It's very visible to them. And then now it's getting to the point where that's becoming 10 to 15 people a week who are reaching out to us and saying, what can we do? Give us some actionable items. And so, we've really been focused on pivoting to a space where we say, here are some actual items that you can do, but still wanting people to understand what you need to do in order to get to making the use of those items more effective, right? And so it's been a lot of conversation about people wanting training and wanting to understand what to do and still being in this space of trying to get people to recognize that first we have to start with changing ourselves because we build systems, and if we want to take those systems down, we can't use the same tools that we had to build them. And so it's been a lot of conversations around that, and it's just extreme heightened urgency of people reaching out, wanting to help and needing to know how.
I think that's actually a great segue. Thank you for so eloquently talking about that into a discussion about allyship, right? Because this is something that is going to require everyone to get involved in order to change these things. So like you say, we're seeing an outpouring of social media support, different networks supporting the Black community, and a lot of buzz around this concept of allyship. But something that I'm wary of is, though it may be well-intentioned, the current discourse may not actually lead to action and truly advancing the cause of justice. So from your perspective, how does one succeed in being a good ally?
Yeah, there's a number of ways that you can do that. I want to talk to allies who are parents. I'm going to talk to allies who have powerful positions in companies. I'm going to talk to allies who are out there protesting. There's a number of different ways that we all need to approach the issue of racism in this country for the same outcome, and that's to stop it from happening, right? And so the first thing I'm going to say to everyone that is applicable is thinking about how you change the way that you think first, because you have to understand that a lot of these things have come to us through social programming, through the hate that exists within our country, right? Through privilege and access, and not having to think about oppression if we don't face it. And so if you are an ally, you have to remember that allyship means that you are allying for a group or fighting for a group that you're not a member of. I think that there's also been this misconception about what that means. So that means that I might be an ally for men in a position, or a man might be an ally for me, or a non-gender binary population, right? Or a white person because I'm Black, or a person who is non-Black who is allying for me at this time of racism. And so I want you all to understand that first, because first you have to do some internal work in order to understand where your privileges lie, where your oppressions lie, and where your biases lie. And I'm saying that because if you are a human being that is privileged and you are going into a space as an ally for someone who does not have the privilege that you do, like what you said, Kelly, that could be, you could have the best of intentions and want to be authentic, and the impact could be very, very harmful. And so you need to check your biases when you walk through the door, as you're sitting in the room, and even when you leave the room, right? Or whatever space it is that you are in. That's the first step. For example, if you are a parent and you want to educate your children about racism, remember that you're also educating yourself in the process. There's a ton of literature, and dot.LA is going to provide the resources on in the context of this webinar. So make sure you go look at those things. But remember, we want, for example, I posted the other day on Twitter and said, I want white parents to start telling their children how not to kill Black people, right? Just like I want to look at, or just as much as a prevalency as I have to tell my nephews and my nieces how to react if and when the police stop them, and know that there's still a chance that they could die because they are Black. And so I want to be mindful of the fact that when you are educating someone and you are using the right resources, you need to understand what the outcomes are that you are hoping for, right? And so we're, as a country right now, we're going through this process of rehumanizing, for example, Black people, because of the dehumanization that has occurred through racism. And so, there's 3 spaces for allies that we call being awake, being awoke, and doing the work, right? Some of us are already awake. Some of y'all were already awake and thinking, okay, racism exists. I know that. And now some of y'all are woke and like, holy shit, this is happening in my community and I am impacting it in some way, shape, or form. And now you want to do the work. Well, work involves self-work, and it involves us to do work at the institutional level. You have to be willing to approach all of those, and sometimes simultaneously, because of the sense of urgency that's happening now.
Well, I like that, awake, woke, and do the work. And I think it's something really interesting that you mentioned at the beginning around this concept of allyship is the difference between being an ally and being an advocate. And I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on that, because I think it's something that from the outside looking in, I might use interchangeably, but they're actually very, very different things.
They are. So allies, or advocacy, I'll start with first, means that a person is a member of an oppressed or marginalized group and they are fighting for their rights, right? So for example, I might be advocating for women's rights because I identify as a woman. I am aligned with that social group. I understand some of the pressures that are happening with that social identity, and I want to fix it. So I'm going to fight for it because I know that that directly impacts me as a woman in this space. If I'm an ally, that means that you're not a woman, but you are fighting for my rights because you believe that I deserve them, right? And you understand how it might directly and indirectly impact you in some way, shape, or form. So you could be non-gender binary, you could be a male, and you're like, I want to fight for women's rights. You come into this space as an ally and not as an advocate. And the reason being, and specifically for men, if you have that privilege, if you have male privilege, for example, if you have white privilege, doesn't mean that you're not oppressed or that you don't have other types of oppressions. It just means that you understand mine and you want to fight for them, and understand that that may be coming from your population and that you need to do something to change it. So those two they're not the same thing, and they show up to the fight differently. And so people need to understand that, so that when you go into spaces where empowerment is happening, you don't unintentionally disempower someone else because of the privilege that you have that you may not even be aware of or think exists or know how it impacts that fight directly.
I appreciate you so eloquently explaining that, because I think something that is so important is the language and how you're approaching those different situations, recognizing where you come from, right, in order to best help. And I want to dig deeper on something that you said about impact versus intent. So we can come with the very best of intentions to a situation, but if we aren't understanding the nuances and the nuances of the systems that have been created, it really doesn't necessarily matter the intent. So I'd love for you to expand a little bit around that and how we can combat that impact versus intent dynamic.
Right, because I don't know if you heard this phrase, the hottest places in hell are reserved for people who are neutral during
I love that phrase.
of challenge or oppression, right? And so the reason that I speak to impact and intent is because often, for example, people say, if you're not doing anything, you're a part of the problem. And that's true, right? So your intent might be that I don't want to touch this. I don't have anything to do with it. I'm not an oppressor. I don't believe in racism. I'm not going to touch it. Well, the impact of your intent, while good, saying that you don't want to harm anybody, is still perpetuating harm, because your silence is violence to us. Because if you see it, you recognize it, and you know it, and you don't speak up about it, then because your silence is you don't want to add to the problem, or your reason is you don't want to add to the problem, but your silence is actually adding to our problem, right? It's intent versus impact. It's like if I'm on the stage speaking and a white ally, and I'm talking about racism and how it impacts Black people, and a white person who's in the crowd or on the stage has the intent to want to support me, but they are not creating the space for me to speak, or respecting the fact that I'm creating the space for me to speak myself, and they overtalk me, or they take hold of the conversation, right? They emotionally get overwhelmed and cry, and all the attention in that conversation goes to them. Well, now you're no longer in the form of an ally. You are an issue here because you have taken up this space to talk about your own experience when the issue that we're discussing doesn't directly impact you, right? And so it's about, as an ally, knowing when to shut up and knowing when to show up. And you have to understand where you lie in that spectrum.
I think that that's a really powerful example that you use. That so much of what we're seeing, right, is social media posts and, oh gosh, how could we have let this go on for so long? And that really is making the conversation, right, about me, or about, whomever is doing that. You so eloquently painted that picture of you being on stage and, in theory, having that space to discuss these things, to use your voice to share your stories, and being overshadowed by someone who is so well-intentioned, but the impact isn't there. So let's turn this from a conversation, though, to action, because there's something that you said in a video the other day. Enough with the conversations. We're having so many conversations, and that's good to some extent, but how are we going to change anything without action? So I'd love to get into how can we actively fight racism? Now that we're having the conversation, what's next?
Yeah, I think it's very important here to state the fact that people need to understand that the notion of help can perpetuate racism. And let me explain what that means. So often when we go into spaces to help people, we go into it with the lens that we want them to live the same life that we live, and that they need the same things that we need. And that's not the case, right? So if you are thinking about going into a space and helping people who are oppressed and marginalized, especially at a time when we're talking about racism, you need to understand that helping them doesn't mean making their lives more like yours. It means helping to create the lives that they feel they deserve in order to achieve certain outcomes, right? Because we want the same outcomes. We all want to live equitably and fairly in the world, and equally in the world, but we may not need the same things to get there, right? So what you might give to one group, another group might not need. So you need to understand that the notion of help itself is rooted in bias. And when you are stepping to the plate and hearing this conversation, that you understand where you're coming from and what it actually means to help someone. And in order to do that, you have to listen to them when they tell you what it is that they need. Because I read this morning, Kelly, I was watching a video by Candace Owens, and she was talking about not how we don't often listen to people like Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, et cetera, and how we put LeBron James on this pedestal. And I was thinking to myself, all those people show up to help our community in different ways. Who's to say which help is better for who? Because there's some people that are going to resonate with Colin Powell. There's some people that's going to resonate with Condoleezza Rice. And then there's some human beings that are going to resonate with LeBron James, because they all help our communities differently. So just keep that in mind, okay? Now, to get to the question, like, what are some concrete things that people can do? In specific, I'm going to start with individuals. First, you got to find a way to check your bias. And I'm saying that, I said it before, but when I say that, here's what I mean. I mean, you need to read literature, look at videos, etc., that teach you how to understand how your bias shows up. Because we're not saying that you're a bad person because you have them, but it goes back to intent versus impact. Because if you go into an institution, for example, Kelly, if we go in to apply for a job and everyone around the hiring table is male, and everyone around the hiring table is white, there's a disadvantage to both of us for the fact that we're women, but there's a double disadvantage to me
Right.
because I'm Black and nobody at that table looks like me, right?
Right.
So the start is, even if you did in a company put a diverse panel at the table because you said we want to show diversity and we want you to see that more people look like you, if you haven't reframed your questions and your job qualifications and the needs that you have for that job to understand who I am and where I come from and how that impacts the product that you're building, you will still perpetuate bias, and you are unintentionally tokenizing the people who are sitting in those positions, right? And so it's about the fact that I'm using that example because as individuals, we create companies, we create systems. We're going to need to recreate those systems. It's not about going in and running the same system and hoping for a different impact because your beliefs have changed. No, when your beliefs change, so should the way that you operate in the world. Because most people will say, "Oh, I shouldn't have said that." And I say it all the time, no, you shouldn't have thought that. But in order to do that, first you have to change the way that you think, because the way that you think will change the way that you speak. And so go do the work. Go look at, for example, the Kirwan Institute, who studies implicit bias. You're talking about neurodiversity. They have a center at Stanford where they talk about bias and they do research. There's so much content out there that's accessible to you. You need to get more intentional about first going to look at it so that you understand it. And you need to make sure that you take your children with you, take your nieces and nephews with you, take your younger generations and older generations who are willing to change with you. That's the first step.
As a follow-up question, I'd love to ask. So, okay, we go out there, we're educating ourselves. How would you suggest still getting involved in conversations and starting to dismantle those systems? Because you could read and read and read and continue educating yourself. I'm never going to be able to understand exactly what you've gone through. There's just no education, because I'll never experience that. Once you're in the process of doing that, do you start to test and have those conversations in a more woke, to use the phrase, and actionable way, without, like we said, having the best intent, but having the wrong impact?
Yeah. First is, if you really don't know and you really feel uncomfortable, but you go into that space, go into it quietly and go into it humbly, because I guarantee you there's probably someone in that space who's thinking or saying the same things that I am to you about what needs to change. But the challenge is, when you look at them, you may not fully respect them as much as you do someone who has accomplished certain things that you think are valuable. Right? And so we immediately devalue a human being, and because of that, we're less likely to listen to them. So first is that. The second is, when you go into companies, you need to look at your systems. And what I mean are, you need to look at the internal and the external, right? So that means if you have an employee handbook, you could start there. You could go look to see whether or not there's inclusive language in your employee handbook. You could be looking at your performance evaluations. You could be looking at your product. For example, if you are thinking about a product where you are creating accessibility to populations, how does it impact people who live with disabilities? How does it impact Black people who live with disabilities? It's the same context. It's about being intentional, about looking to see where the gaps exist. If you're a person that's heavy in data, like me, I'm a big data head. I love numbers. I will look to see where trends of inequity might exist by breaking data down, by looking at the demographic root of it. So what I want to know is who's being impacted and how. And in order for me to do that, first, the numbers have to start to tell me a story, but I need to be looking at them with a lens of equity, right? I'm saying that, for example, there are white supremacists and people in the world who disagree with me. And one of the things that I don't do is I don't completely ignore them. I need to understand what they're saying and the things that they say about our populations, because remember, some of them sit in the institutions that perpetuate racism. And if you want to help undo that, you got to know how they think, because remember, the master's tools will not break down the master's house, right? And so we have to start to train ourselves to think differently, and we have to look at every system that we have in the workplace, in our educational systems, even at home, that does that, right? Because in our educational systems, we know that there's a disproportionality when it comes to discipline for Black children and brown children. And so the first question that you want to ask is, why does this happen? So I'm
Mhm.
looking at who's making the decision to get rid of these children, right? Who's writing them up? Who's spending them from school? What are the commonalities that they have? And how do I understand those so I can break down to them where those show up and how that impacts children, right? And it's not to demonize you or to say that you are a bad person. Now, what makes you a bad person is if someone points out to you the inequities that are happening, how inconsistent they are, and you look at both sides of the narratives and you still see that something is incomplete and you decide to do nothing,
Mm.
that makes you an asshole, right? And so there's varying degrees of what asshole looks like. And some of us are at the top of that pyramid, some of us are at the bottom, because we all have a little bit in it. But it's about how you use that in order to either create spaces where people can empower themselves and where you have equity and equality, or you use it to shut them down because you just don't want to deal with it because you are facing fragility and crying about the fact that this is happening and you don't know what to do. Right? Go cry, do what you need to do, then come back and act.
Mhm.
Mm.
Well, I think that I appreciate how actionable your advice is, because I think some of what we're seeing is we're spinning in these conversations that we're having. There's a problem, we need to address it. And I've often come away from some webinars, some conversations, and feeling like, okay, but still what's next? So I think you've really eloquently laid out what is next. And as Cheryl mentioned, there's a lot of resources that her company has been putting together that we're going to share with the dot.LA community. So if you are interested, and I hope you are, what is next? What can I go do? So I'd love to shift the focus slightly now to what startups and tech companies can do to make diversity, equity, and inclusion core parts of their culture and workspaces, since that's what you do every single day professionally. And I think that the individual actions are intimately linked to what we're going to see at companies. So we've seen the social media posts, we've heard the promises about donating to social justice nonprofits that these companies are making. But what can founders, CEOs, leaders actually do? So let's say I'm in a leadership position, okay, at a tech company. What's the first thing that I do now that I see that there's a problem and I want to act?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for leaders, especially in tech or anybody working in tech and in the startup space, it is vitally important that you understand how your business case impacts the issues that are happening in the world right now. Start there. And the reason why I say that is because I promise you, I talk to CEOs and tech companies all the time, and they want to make sure that whatever they do meets their business's bottom line. But if the challenge is that your business's bottom line is not in alignment with the communities that you're serving, and it's not impacting equity and equality in a positive way, you got to reframe your business's bottom line first. And that means changing your mission sometimes, your vision and your values to represent what it is that you intend to do and to show the impact of how that happens. Here's another example. For example, most tech companies have social responsibility programs or are in the midst of doing some sort of giving, right? Now, what traditionally has been done is that you've been giving money to populations, maybe even lobbying for certain legislation, et cetera, to impact your business's bottom line. Do you see where the miss is if your business's bottom line is not about community empowerment? So that means that if you are lobbying for something or you're supporting a candidate and you want to donate to that candidate, with your donation should come with a stipulation that you are able to advertise what that candidate has done for that community and how that might meet your business's bottom line or the communities that you don't serve, the underrepresented and the marginalized. Because you tech companies are just like what large oil companies were back in the day and even currently who run politicians, right? You have the ability to have the same impact, so why not run them in a different way that isn't harmful to the Black community or isn't harmful to climate change or the LGBTQIA plus community and immigrant communities, et cetera. You have the money to make a difference, and you have the power and influence and the platforms to make a difference. So start there with your social responsibility programs, for example, even the educational programs that you create. Remember No Child Left Behind, Kelly, and Obama's Race to the Top? while though the intent was for those to help create academic achievement, especially in marginalized communities, what it did was it ended up punishing us. Because what happened is communities who, inner city schools, etc., who couldn't get that money or who couldn't achieve the academic achievement that you wanted us to achieve, you took money from them, even though the achievement was based on a culturally biased standardized test, for example, right? Tech companies, you show up because y'all are creating the future for us. If you're going to train children and you want them to be software engineers and children are interested in math and science, how can you develop more software development programs within those communities and take away these culturally biased tests and create more of a vocational trajectory for students who want it, whether it's arts, whether it's tech, etc. Right? You see the kind of power and influence that you have in our communities. You also need to be looking at the health of the communities that you're in. For example, when you think about asthma and the way it disproportionately impacts low economic status children who live in communities where you have plants, et cetera, and you're polluting the air, you know, you get out of those communities, you're going to need to spend more money on resources that don't release toxic chemicals into the air that we breathe that's poisoning our communities and our children. Right? And so those things are so important. Your employee resource groups that you have in the building who represent the populations that you have and they're fighting for them, they need decision-making power at your board table. They need decision-making power at your executive table. You need to give them some sort of deciding vote in how you show up and impact the community directly and indirectly, because they live in it. They're fighting for it. They love what they do and they work with you and for you. So you need to grant them as much respect as they grant you when they come to work every day and bust their ass to make a livable wage and also help to achieve the dream of your CEO and your founder, right? And so you need to be looking at these things and you need to be taking all of this into account. It's much deeper than this surface level crap that we see when you write a statement that says we care about the Black community, but then your business has a massive Black exodus because what you say doesn't represent how you act. And we see that, right? And also for companies who don't want to do it, who don't believe what I'm saying, to the people in them, it's time for you to leave them spaces and go where you are appreciated, because y'all are either going to get in line or fail. And if your intention and bottom line is hurting our community, we'd rather have you fail, right? And I think another thing that I'll say, and I didn't say this earlier, but I want to say it to allies even, is we know that racial injustice is happening and police brutality is happening. And if you don't know what to do, there are a ton of resources for bystander intervention training, and that's what we call it. So go to Google, type in bystander intervention training. There should be online platforms. There should be people who are producing webinars and things for it now. Understand how to get involved, because the people who are protesting on the streets, we need you just as much as you need people in the buildings fighting for the same cause or who are at the top fighting for the same cause. So we need to be working to understand practices on how to protect one another.
Yeah. I appreciate you mentioning that, because that is really important, right? I mean, these things are going to continue happening. It's not enough to be out there protesting, but actively be doing something when you see it. The point that you made about tech companies is really powerful, because I imagine you'd agree, being so based in Los Angeles, we're starting to see tech not just as an industry, but every company in some way is becoming a tech company, or is being forced to step into that space. So I think that first lesson, if I'm putting myself back in that founder or CEO level, is think about how our resources are being used. Ensure that leaders of ERG groups have decision-making power, have that seat at the table. So next step, something that I've seen you mention a lot in your videos is this concept of a chief diversity officer, and really ensuring that there's someone accountable for that implementation. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how I, as the founder and CEO in this position, might utilize that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I want to give you an example. There are companies whose IT departments are amazing, right? They kick ass. And I can guess that you have a CTO, you probably have even a VP of IT, you probably have a director of IT, and then you probably have people underneath that person who also make sure that the machine is operating the way that it's supposed to be.
Sure.
Diversity has to be set up the same way. Your chief diversity officer is a person who should be at the top, who is understanding everything that's working underneath them, and they need systems of support. The problem is we don't treat diversity, equity, and inclusion like we do
Right.
IT.
Right.
And so you need to understand that DEI needs to be ingrained in everything that you do in your company. And this person is the overseer of that, with a ton of resources under them to help them achieve what it is that they need to achieve to help meet your business's bottom line. For example, like we have a space at our work where we now do intern chief diversity officers who will go into a company, they sign a 6-month to a year-long contract, and that person becomes your advisor, and they work directly with you to help build a system that supports diversity, equity, and inclusion the same way you build a system to support technology in your company.
Right.
That person needs to be overseeing and in charge of the competencies that are applied to every position at every level. For example, if your director of IT is managing a diverse team, which they should be visibly and invisibly, then their competencies need to be based around that to make sure that the way that you measure success is related to the way that they treat people. And so it's important to set up and have someone who's in your company at every level: admin, entry level, mid-level, senior level, and executive level, right? When it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, because there's different parts that all of those roles will play to make sure it's intertwined into everything that you do. Because people will hire a chief diversity officer, and you know where you talked about this earlier, Kelly, they'll walk away and say, it's that person's job. We
Right.
do the best that we can. We're going to let them do it, right? That makes your DEI artificial, because if that person sits at the table to solve DEI, everybody that's on the same level with them needs to be sitting at the table listening to them. Because it takes all of us. Diversity should be in the competencies of your janitorial staff. It should be in the competencies of your executives. And it needs to, I'm saying this because when you change the behavior, you change the person and you change the outcomes. And if we start to create those behavioral expectations and an entire rewards to them, and not just intrinsic, but extrinsic rewards to them, we'll start to see people behave and perform differently and believe differently within those spaces. But you need a chief diversity officer if you don't have one. And I'm saying to companies who are large, if you don't have one now, you should probably get one. And to startups who are raising money on funding rounds, build one into your system before it gets too big, so that you don't have to play catch up when a discrimination or something pops up in your company. Start to build it from the foundation of what you're doing. And if it's too late for you in your company, like a Microsoft, who is probably has a chief diversity officer, I'm sure that they do, and tons of VRGs, and diversity may still not be working, it means that you're missing something. And it's not just that that person doesn't know how to do their job. Because the last thing I'll say is, many companies hire people to do diversity, equity, inclusion. Those people tend to look like me, or they tend to look like you, Kelly, to be fair. Black women, white women. And I'm not saying that they don't hire other populations. My point is that they tend to hire marginalized and underrepresented populations to run diversity, equity, and inclusion, give them limited resources, and expect maximum outcomes. And that's not fair. And so I'm saying to you, if you put a person who is passionate about the work into the work, you need to make sure you have systems that support their efforts so that they're successful. Because when they're successful, your DEI programs are more successful, or your DEI DNA is more successful.
I really appreciate that focus on making it sustainable. And the example that you use, right? You put someone in that position and then just walk away and say, okay, cool, I've checked the box. Everyone knows that my company is really focused on this. Look, I'm even taking action, but that's not doing the work. Putting in the work every single day to ensure that that person is supported, they have those resources, and it's making it part of the DNA of the company. I think that that's something that is really powerful. Related to that, I'd love to talk a little bit more about, okay, now we've got people in the door, right? Like, we have someone at my company, my fictional company, that's, I hope it's successful, that is focused on this. We have people from ERG groups in leadership positions that have decision-making power. But we're still having a problem with turnover, because it's not just about getting people in the door and being able to report that, look at these metrics about our company, we're X%, representative of this community and that community. How do we make the culture inclusive? How do we make those minorities, those people from the Black community, from wherever, we're focusing on the Black community right now, feel valued and included?
Yeah. The first thing I'm going to say, and I will lean into the camera so that y'all get it. Stop thinking that training is going to solve your problems. 90% of the calls that we get are people just looking for training.
Mm-hmm.
That is not enough. Training is a solution is a part of a solution to a much bigger solution, right? And so the question that you asked me, Kelly, is like, how do you ingrain it into your culture? There are, I would say, 14 different categories across companies that we look at when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion.
All right, let's hear them.
I don't know if I'll get all 14 out,
okay.
but I'll tell you some of them.
Go ahead, some of them.
The first is leadership and accountability. So the
Mm-hmm.
goals, the metrics, the strategies that you create at the top have to be sustainable for every level of your company. And that's what you should be thinking about when you're doing diversity, equity, and inclusion. You need to create goals, metrics, outcomes, and rewards for people who meet them in your company. And sometimes a reward is you did your job, you get to keep your job, right? And consequences, if you don't do your job and you're not doing it well, and we've exhausted and done everything in this formula to make it right and it still doesn't work, that is probably time for that person to move on, right? But leadership and accountability, you need to be looking at diversity, equity, inclusion from that lens. Job compensation, offer, benefits, etc., wellness even in your company, and what that means needs to include components of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The way that you communicate in your company, I'm talking about standing meetings, all team meetings, executive team meetings, etc. In every agenda that you have, diversity, equity, and inclusion needs a spot for you to talk about it. And when you talk about it, I'm not just talking about training programs. I'm talking about, how did our product and development go when it comes to DEI? What's that data looking like, right? Because you're always going to look at data, but now you need to be able to include demographics in it so that you can understand if and when there are gaps, which is why I'm building a company that's doing that slowly but surely. The next is education. I'm not going to take away from training. I'm just not going to ride it till the fucking wheels fall off like most people do. I'm telling you that you do need training, but training needs to, one, be customized around the outcomes that you're developing for your company. So, for example, if you understand that managers in your company in engineering are having a hard time retaining people of color or women, etc., Black people, since we're talking about racism, there's probably some competency there that needs to happen for that manager. If they're willing to learn it and they want to change, you go get it for them, right? That's part of investing in people. That's part of meeting your business's bottom line, because there's this book, it's called The Hard Thing About the Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. And in that book, he talks about three things. He says you need to be focused on people and product, and then that will impact your profit. Those are the three things. So I'm saying, when you do DEI, look at those three lenses from a DEI lens, or look at those three spaces from a DEI lens: people, product, and profit, right? How many categories did I list? 4 or 5?
I think we got to about 4, yeah.
There's more. I think some of the other ones that I haven't said, for example, are marketing. When you look at your marketing in a company, and advertisement, you need to be looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's so many more that are leaving my mind right now, but they're all over every facet of a company that you could think about. Social responsibility and government is another. Health and wellness is another. There's some that we don't even think that we need to look at it DEI of the lens with, but we do. For example, people will say, wellness, how do you look at wellness with the DEI lens? Well, first of all, if you look at medical research, you'll see that different populations are more susceptible to different types of health diagnosis, right? High cholesterol, diabetes, etc. And so we have to start to think, when we look at wellness programs in companies, then we build them for the populations that we intend to serve and that we are serving. what kind of issues impact the community? How does bias in the medical field impact the way that these populations might be served? Because it won't matter if you have a great health and wellness benefit program if you don't have ties to doctors who service those, or medical professionals who service those particular populations for those issues and actually care. It doesn't matter how great your health program is, because when a Black woman walks into an office, she's more likely to be mistreated by a doctor who doesn't look like her. So that's a way to think about wellness, is how do you offer that in a way that creates equality and equity, and that's extremely important for people to understand.
Well, those are some really important things to think about. And I want to take this one step further, ingraining this into the culture, right? So I think what is really unfortunate, you often see is, employees saying, oh, okay, this person only got this role because of the focus on DEI.
Yeah.
This, whether it's a woman, a Black person, any minority, I think that unfortunately that perspective comes through a lot. And so we're being told, okay, don't stay silent. Speak up when you see things like this happening. That mindset, that aspect coming into the conversation.
Yeah.
From your perspective, how do you do that also in a professional setting, in a professional way? Because I know how you do it on social media, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
How do I, as the CEO at the company, or someone on the lower levels, right, that is seeing this, how do I call that out and have a productive and professional discussion about it?
Yeah. So we have this thing at Diverse City and Inclusology where we speak about tokenization versus representational equity, right? And how, as a company, do you practice representational equity as opposed to tokenization? Because, like you said, say you get the populations in the door and change is not happening. There's a couple of reasons why that could happen. The main one is usually that you don't want to listen to that person. You brought them in to make you feel better. So when a person, for example, is looking at your strategy, if you're a person at the entry level and you go to a sponsor or a mentor that you have in a company, and you even go directly to your CEO because they have an open door policy, and that person tells you, here's what we're seeing. One, if you're the person that's going to that conversation, especially if you're going to talk to a tech CEO, you better be coming with some data, both qualitative and quantitative. You need to show this person how it's impacting their company and how it's impacting the people in it, right? And so if you want to prove that case, for example, you get with your HR department, or you get with your manager who has access to that data, and you print it out, you have a conversation, you even build an alliance within your company so that multiple people understand it. Because the more people who listen to you and speak for you, the louder that voice is and speak with you and not just for you, right? Let me be clear. If you are speaking to a mentor or a sponsor, mentor speaks to you, sponsor speaks for you. Means that they're at a place where you can't get to. So you need to educate that person if you're willing to do the work, or give them the resources for them to educate themselves if you tend to be exhausted like we often do. And when you take that conversation to your CEO, again, make sure that you have that information if you're at the entry level or any level that says, here's the problem. Now, here's the myths that most human beings have. When you go to represent the problem, you have no solution. And one of the things, and I'm a CEO, so I'm saying this very bluntly, one of the things we get tired of is hearing about all the problems and not hearing enough about solutions. And so if you're going to go in there with a plan, remember a plan has the problem and the solution.
Yeah.
And so you need both, right? No matter what level you are at. Understand, though, that the CEO might be more prone to listen to the people who sit at the table with them daily. So make sure you have a representative or multiple representatives there who understand that. Now, as a CEO, it is your job to make sure that you instill those competencies in your colleagues who sit around the table with you. If you're hiring them, you're paying them, you're building their job descriptions, you build that into it, right? And make sure that you have somebody who knows what they're doing. Your chief diversity advisor or officer should be helping you do that with information from your employee voice. You see, because entry-level employees, mid-level employees, you'll hear people say, we listen to all our employees. Yeah, you do, but you listen to them differently. Some people you listen with the intention of acting, the intention to act, and some people you listen with the intention just to hear to make them feel better so they can go back to doing their damn jobs, right? That you got to get rid of the latter and place the same amount of respect on a janitor as you would on your CEO when they offer you context that's supported by actual experiences. Because remember, when I say data, how many of you thought about numbers? I'm one of them. Experiences are data. They just have to be collected and applied accurately. And it's important for us to create spaces for feedback loops in our company, and with the intention that there's going to be action that is followed. Because if people come to you and complain and they still see you do nothing, you start to lose credibility. And when you lose credibility, you lose trust. And when you lose trust, you lose employee voice because they stop speaking to you.
Wow, I could not agree more with what you just said. I mean, thinking about some of the experiences and the ways that I've seen work when people come forward with that. And I want to emphasize the point that you made about listening to everyone equally, regardless of their title or position within the company, because they're also experiencing these things differently. They're experiencing diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how that is affecting the company in different ways. Because the person at the top of the company is not going to hear all of the little things, right, that an entry level employee might experience on a daily basis. And so I think sometimes it's even more important to hear what's going on at those lower levels, because by the time it gets to you at the top, right, it's filtered. Like it's a game of telephone too.
That's right. That's right.
So listen, we could talk about this for forever, and I appreciate how actionable you have made everything that we've spoken about. But I just wanted to give you the space. Is there anything else that you would add to wrap up the discussion that you think is important for folks to hear?
Yeah, interesting enough, and I'm saying this in the context because we've had a lot of conversations about forgiveness, and so I am no way perpetuating forgiveness, but I'm prefacing it with this because it helped me a lot. I just read this book called Radical Forgiveness, Kelly, and one of the biggest takeaways I took from that book is if I wanted to change, I had to do something I'd never done before, right? And I think that now is the time for some radical shifts. And so, for example, you hear me saying things to you like, you need to give your employee resource group a decision-making power at your board table or something like that. Some people are going to say, we've never done it that way. Well, good. Because the way that you have done it is showing that it's not working. So now try something different. And I mean, so different and radical that you'd be surprised that the outcomes might blow your mind if you give it a chance. So get out of this place of safety, because as you see now, Black Lives Matter, we operate in a space of not being safe. You see people on the streets taking risks knowing that they could be shot in the face with a rubber bullet or handcuffed and have someone kneeling on their neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. You know what I'm saying? And so it's like, if we see the same shit like that happening all the time, it's time for some radical shifts in order to change the outcomes. Because even when we think about segregation and we think about the civil rights movement, we've taken a lot of steps back, which means that at the time, in that moment, it was impactful. And then the world went right back to doing it. The thing about a movement is that it doesn't stop. That's what makes movement. It's constant. And so it's important for us in our movement now to be constant. And then that's going to take some radical decision-making to try some shit that we've just never done before.
I think that that's really powerful point to end on. So I appreciate you sharing that. Viewers, in the description of this video, we are going to be linking all of the resources that Cheryl has mentioned during our conversation today. So if this resonated with you, and I hope that it did, please go check them out. And then Cheryl, I want to thank you for being so raw during this conversation. Like I said, I can't even imagine how overwhelming this time is with people reaching out to you for answers. So I really appreciate your time and your trusting me with the opportunity to amplify your voice. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you getting on the call with me. We filmed this on Sunday, y'all, but it's going.
I know this is happening Sunday. This is how
Right.
important this is, right?
We working for y'all today, so y'all work, continue to work every day because we will. But thank y'all for creating the space. I'm always grateful to dot.LA for willing to have this conversation, because not everybody lets me show up and be raw and authentic, and often in those spaces I tend to not participate. So thank y'all for the opportunity and for airing this, and I hope that it helps some people who are looking for guidance. And please, a lot of people put those resources together and took the time to write and create all the stuff that I'm giving you. So just take the time to look at it. I guarantee you something on it you'll find helpful.
Very well said. Thank you so much, Cheryl.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. Have a great one.